She's known as Ghost Tech, an invisible analyst with a deadly secret. When a deadly ambush traps an elite SEAL team in the frozen heights of Iron Pass, only a shadow from the past can save them. Years ago, she survived this canyon alone, outsmarting death at every turn. And now, she's back to rewrite history. I crouched low in the shadowed cut of Iron Pass, the jagged cliffs pressing in on three sides like stone sentinels. The hum of distant engines vibrated through the rock, and every instinct screamed that we were walking into a trap. My hands hovered over the cold metal of my backpack, tracing the edge of the equipment I had been told to monitor, not wield. The radio squawked with static, useless. Every Allied outpost I had tracked in the area had gone silent, their lights fading from my screen one by one. A tight knot of tension formed in my chest. Then, a shot cracked from the ridge above, clean, precise. I froze. Another shot followed, then a third. The enemy's formation below began to collapse into chaos. I whispered under my breath, almost expecting the walls to answer. "Is someone up there?" Commander Vale's voice came through my earpiece, low and tense. "She's here." Her. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. They only knew me as a quiet systems analyst stationed at Aurora Point 22, a freezing outpost perched at the northern edge of the Cascadia Range. My official role was terrain scans, signal interception, and forensic support after unexplained patrol disappearances. I was supposed to sit in a corner, taking notes, invisible. To the operatives around me, I was Ghost Tech, a quiet observer with a laptop, a camera, and a pair of binoculars. But I'd been walking these mountains long before any of them had heard my name. They didn't know the ridges I could reach, the angles I could predict, the shots that could never be documented. I slipped past the armory without the guard noticing, my fingers brushing over the racks until I found the rifle that had been deemed unreliable, the M2055. The scope had drift issues at altitude, they said, but they had built it for flat grounds, not the knife-edge ridges of Iron Pass. 3 days prior, I had recalibrated it quietly, adjusted for the wind patterns and thermal currents unique to Ridge 17. The maps they handed me weren't just lines, they were memories. Every elevation, every cliff face, every shadowed alcove had a rhythm, a story, a pulse. I had memorized it all long ago. Every morning, I traced the contours of the land while others sipped coffee or video called home. By noon, I would vanish for exactly 27 minutes, just long enough to check angles, measure wind drafts, and record what sensors could never detect. Specialist Torres once joked, "Either Ghost Tech has supernatural instincts, or she's been here before." He was closer than he knew. The SEAL unit had already moved into the gorge. They didn't realize the trap waiting for them. Exit paths were blocked, communications dead, clouds rolling in thick and fast, grounding aerial support. And there I was, on a ridge that their intelligence had written off as unreachable, my breath steady, my eyes scanning. I had been here before, not just in training simulations or reconnaissance photos. I had been here, alone, years ago, surviving a mission that left the rest of my unit gone. And now, when the canyon became a death trap again, something quiet inside me stirred. Not vengeance, not fear, but the unwavering resolve that I wouldn't let history repeat itself. I adjusted my scope, checked the wind drift, 0. 62 degrees left, thermal currents slight, but manageable. My target came into view, and I pulled the trigger, 1, 2, 3. The gorge below erupted into confusion. Machine guns stuttered to silence. Leaders fell. The enemy scrambled, unable to predict the unseen presence above. The team looked up, bewildered. Who was watching their backs from that impossible ridge? I stepped back, letting my silhouette merge with the rocky outcroppings. No one saw me leave. No one would ever know my presence here. But the canyon had been altered by my intervention, lives preserved by choices made long before anyone else understood the stakes. I returned to my desk at Aurora Point 22 exactly 19 minutes after leaving. Dust clung to my jacket, frost rimmed my boots. My laptop hummed quietly, continuous logs blinking in a rhythm only I could read. Standard tactical noise, I said when asked about anomalies. Nothing more. But inside, I knew the mountain had spoken, and I had listened. I remember the first time Iron Pass truly tested me. 3 years ago, I had been part of the Frostline Recon, a specialized 6-person team sent deep into the Cascadia Range. Our mission was forward observation, track enemy movement, relay positions, and secure paths for humanitarian convoys in zones nobody else dared enter. It had started like any other op: crisp air, early frost on the rocks, a sense of calm before the storm. But 3 weeks in, everything fell apart. Communications went dark. Satellites showed silence over our coordinates. Gear was found scattered, bodies never recovered. The official report claimed we had been overrun. No survivors. I was supposed to be gone too, but I wasn't. I had been posted on Ridge 17, a vantage point no one thought could be reached at that hour. My orders were simple: observe, record, do not engage. The other 5 held their positions to buy time. They knew they would die if they left. I watched through the early morning haze, seeing the enemy close in, knowing I couldn't warn my team without revealing my location. Every breath I took was measured, every heartbeat counted. By the 3rd day, the convoy's new route was compromised. Artillery was being set up. Civilians were at risk. That was when I acted. 3 shots. 3 carefully calculated shots that eliminated the forward observers. Their eyes went blind. Their artillery lost precision. The convoy moved. The lives of 200 people shifted into safety because of 3 bullets fired from a ridge that no one believed was reachable. Then I vanished. Alone. 6 days of survival followed. The enemy hunted me, a phantom on snow and rock. I lived on frozen rations, melting snow for water, using storms to mask my heat signature. I slept where no one would find me, moved only when shadows and wind offered concealment. Each ridge, each angle, each gust of wind was a language I spoke fluently. When the rescue team finally reached me, they found someone who had survived against impossible odds. Frostbitten fingers, sunken eyes, dehydration, the remnants of a human pushed to her absolute limit. Yet, even then, my focus didn't waver. My team was gone. My mission had succeeded. But I was still watching, still aware, still alive in a way that nobody could understand. I refused commendations. I refused therapy. I didn't want medals or recognition. I requested to be reassigned to back-end operations, analysis, comms, logistics, anything that kept me out of direct fire. I wanted to vanish, to become part of the shadows I had learned to move through. And yet, Iron Pass had drawn me back. The SEALs moving through the gorge below were walking into the echoes of my own past. Every blocked path, every collapsed ridge, every false trail, they mirrored the nightmare I had endured years before. My fingers itched for the rifle I had calibrated, my mind running through every trajectory: wind shift, thermal draft, shadow line. I wasn't there for glory. I wasn't there to prove anything. I was there because the canyon remembered me. It remembered what had happened before and whispered the warnings I could interpret. I had walked these ridges alone, carried the weight of those lost, and learned how to speak with the mountain in a way no sensor or satellite ever could. The SEALs didn't know it yet, but their survival depended on a ghost who had walked their path once before, someone who could bend the impossible into reality with patience, precision, and silence. As I traced the outlines of the gorge on my laptop, replaying every sensor reading, I felt that same quiet determination rise in me. I would not allow history to repeat itself. Not for them. Not for anyone. I clipped the headset back in, my fingers brushing the edge of the M2055 as if it were an extension of my own arm. Ridge 17 waited for me, the air thin, the wind unpredictable, the stones unyielding, but familiar. I had survived Iron Pass before, and I would survive it again, for those who didn't even know they needed me. I stepped out into the snow, leaving the warmth and hum of Aurora Point 22 behind. The M2055 felt heavier than it should have, but it was familiar. Every scar on its body, every adjustment I had made, spoke a language of survival I alone could read. The ridge lay too, for kilometers away, jagged and cruel, rising like a frozen spine against the morning sky. I didn't pause. The incline bit at my lungs, but I matched my breath to the rhythm of the wind. Every gust whispered directions. Every shadow hinted at a possible foothold. I didn't glance back. The gorge below was already alive with the sounds of gunfire, but I couldn't afford distraction. I moved like a memory of myself, tracing paths I had etched into muscle and mind long ago. Rocks that looked unstable weren't. Snow that seemed shallow had hidden ledges. I followed the mountain's rhythm, not the maps. The compass on my wrist told one story, my instincts told another. Always follow the instincts. Always trust the whispers of wind and stone. The SEAL unit had entered the gorge 20 minutes before I left. I knew the angles where they would be pinned, the sectors where machine gun fire would find them first, the choke points where retreat was impossible. Every prediction was drawn from the mistakes I had survived years ago. Halfway up the ridge, I paused on a small ledge, crouched low. The wind gusted from the north, carrying the faint smell of diesel and cordite from below. My scope came alive in my hands. The first target emerged, a gunner attempting to flank the left edge. One breath, one adjustment for wind and elevation, one trigger pull. Clean. Gone. Another appeared, peering over cover, searching for the unseen sniper. Another shot. The pattern repeated, rhythmically, surgically. They had expected ground resistance, maybe a team on the floor of the gorge, but not a ghost at impossible altitude. My eyes never left the gorge. I traced the arcs of their movement, the patterns of their flinches, the subtle cues that told me where their leadership was. A machine gunner adjusted his aim, unaware that the ridge above was already writing his fate. 3 minutes in, chaos bloomed below. The enemy scrambled, leaders fell, and my heart stayed calm. I had done this before. I had survived this before. And yet, every strike carried the weight of years. Every calculated shot a silent tribute to the team I had lost. Breath steady, hands steady, eyes cold but clear, I moved across the ridge in silence. Each step measured, each footprint fleeting, disappearing behind me as snow drifted. I had no intention of staying. My role was intervention, precision, then vanishing. The SEALs glanced toward the ridge repeatedly, whispers of awe and confusion threading through their radio chatter. Who's up there? Confirm ID. No answer came. I was already moving again, recalibrating for a long shot across uneven terrain. My mind was a ledger of wind, distance, heat drafts, angles, and shadows. Nothing went unnoticed. Nothing unaccounted for. And in that quiet, I realized that the ridge had become mine again, not ownership in the traditional sense, but familiarity. A place that had witnessed my survival, my failure, my loss. A place I had learned to read like a diary, to feel like an extension of myself. The first of 3 key targets appeared: command positions, critical support units. 1, 2, 3 carefully timed shots. The enemy faltered, confusion spreading through their ranks. They expected resistance at the bottom, not a ghost above. Not someone who could read their formation before it even moved. I moved again, shadows against the cliff, calculating my next position, preparing for the rounds that would ensure the SEAL team below could survive. The mountain breathed around me, wind speaking in subtle whispers, guiding my hands, shaping my choices. I was part of it, as much as it was part of me. The first contact had begun, but my real work was just starting. I had a clear line of sight now across the gorge. Every shot I had taken had softened the enemy's formation, but there were still gaps to cover, units moving to flank the SEALs. I adjusted the scope again, noting the subtle shift in wind, northwest gusts picking up, heat drafts forming along the granite walls. Each variable mattered. A single miscalculation would cost lives. Below, the SEALs scrambled, pinned against the rocky floor. I could see the desperation in their movements, hear the clipped orders over the faint static of their radios. Commander Vale's voice broke through briefly. "We need that high ground covered. Someone, anyone, help us." I smiled faintly, even as the chill bit at my fingers. Already handled, I thought. The first group of enemy officers moved to consolidate command. That was my priority. I tracked their movements through the scope, counting seconds, measuring wind shifts, anticipating their micro-adjustments. 3 shots, surgical, precise. Each one dropped a leader or critical support unit. Their formation dissolved into confusion. I shifted position, careful to keep my outline hidden against the stone. The mountain provided cover if you knew how to read it. Snow drift patterns, vertical heat currents, even the sound bouncing between cliffs. All of it was information I could interpret instantly. One of the SEALs glanced upward, eyes wide, spotting movement, or at least the illusion of it. Nothing, I thought. That's the point. They shouldn't know I'm here. I moved again along a narrow ledge, descending slightly to find a new vantage point. The wind whistled through the canyon, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of conflict. My focus narrowed. Everything extraneous fell away. The gorge was a living system, and I was reading it as a map of probabilities. Machine gun fire erupted from the right. I traced the shooter's arc, accounting for wind, elevation, and thermal distortion. Another shot. Clean. Another. Silence fell over that section of the gorge. I paused, scanning for the final critical cluster of enemy units. They had taken advantage of the terrain, thinking they could control the center. They hadn't counted on someone who knew the terrain like the back of her hand, someone who had survived these conditions before, someone who could calculate every variable instinctively. I leveled the scope, breathing in rhythm with the mountain. 0, 58 degrees left, slight thermal correction, adjust for drift. Fire. Another 3 strikes. The enemy collapsed completely. No coordinated retaliation, no systematic recovery. Just chaos. Below, the SEALs finally had room to move. I could see them rise, reload, and sweep the canyon floor. Their faces showed disbelief, a mixture of relief and confusion. Who did that? They must have asked themselves. I let them have that question. My role wasn't to be acknowledged. It was to act, to observe, and to vanish again. That's the way I had survived before. That's the way I would survive now. The final machine gunner tried to reposition, unaware that the ridge was already mapped for every possible approach. One more careful shot, and the ridge fell silent. The SEALs had a path out, the enemy was broken, and the gorge had been rewritten by precision and patience. I stepped back along the ledge, my boots leaving faint impressions in the snow. Each step calculated, deliberate. I didn't glance at the SEALs. I didn't wait for thanks. I didn't need to. My presence would remain a secret. My work, my intervention, was enough. The gorge quieted, and I could almost hear the mountain sigh. It had watched me before, and now it had watched me again. I retraced my steps, moving back toward Aurora Point 22. Dust, frost, and snow clung to my jacket, and my breath misted in the cold air. I returned to my desk at the exact moment my log had predicted I would. The laptop hummed, the comms blinked. Everything was exactly as it should be. Standard tactical noise, I murmured when asked about anomalies. Nothing beyond protocol. And yet, I knew the mountain remembered. I returned to Aurora Point 22 just as the team finished their debrief. The SEALs were buzzing with disbelief, recounting the chaos of the gorge below. Commander Vale shot me a glance as I passed, curiosity tempered by respect. No one knew exactly who had saved them, and I intended to keep it that way. Colonel Renard was waiting in the command center, his brow furrowed, fingers tapping an old wooden desk. Who was covering our 6 in the pass? He asked, not waiting for small talk. I simply answered, a vantage point. Ridge 17. You didn't have a friendly assigned. His eyes narrowed. And yet the enemy's formation broke apart. Every critical target neutralized. 3 groups, 3 rounds each, perfect timing. Who? I let him finish his thought in silence. I didn't fill in the blanks. That was never my role. Observation, support, vanish. Vale stepped forward, clearly unsettled. You were there? I nodded once low. I've been here before. The colonel leaned back, exhaling slowly. Before, I tapped the ridge on the map displayed on the hollow screen. Years ago, I survived this canyon. Alone. My team didn't. This ridge, it remembers. I do too. He didn't press further, but the pause spoke volumes. Some stories are better understood in quiet acknowledgement rather than interrogation. The SEALs filed out, leaving only Vale and me. He finally asked what I always expected someone to ask eventually. Why now? I ran a finger along the edge of the map. Because history is repeating itself. The patterns are the same. I couldn't watch this happen twice. Vale's gaze softened slightly. He understood more than he let on. Some truths are felt, not spoken. He didn't need to know everything, just enough to trust the results. I returned to my workstation, boots leaving faint impressions on the frost-slick floor. Dust and snow clung to my jacket, traces of the ridge still marking my presence. I logged data, double-checked coordinates, and made a note of anomalies in wind drift and enemy patterns. Everything clean, everything precise. Yet the air was heavy with something unsaid. They saw a quiet analyst. What they didn't see was the part of me that had survived when others hadn't. The part of me that carried Ridge 17 like a living archive. Vale finally murmured as he left. almost to himself. Not all heroes need to be seen. I smiled faintly, a shadowed curve. He didn't know, couldn't know, that the ridge had been my world before it was theirs. That the mountain and I had negotiated survival in whispers and frozen breath long before any of them had arrived. The day passed quietly after that. Reports filed, logs updated, equipment checked. Yet my mind remained on the gorge, on the canyon floor, and the seals moving safely because someone had been watching when no one else could. Alone at my desk, I pulled up an old terrain file, one I hadn't accessed in years. The lines and contours of Ridge 17 spread across the screen. Each shadowed alcove, each improbable footing, each impossible angle. It all spoke to me, like a diary written in stone and wind. I traced a finger along a particularly narrow ledge. It remembers me, I whispered, and I remembered it. Every gust, every draft, every heartbeat that had carried me through survival before, carrying me again to intervene. The command center hummed softly around me, unaware that the ridge above the canyon had silently shifted the balance of a deadly operation. They would never fully know the calculus that had saved lives, the patience, the precision, the ghost they would never name. For me, it was simple. Observe, act, disappear. That had always been enough. Late that evening, the command center dimmed to near darkness. Monitors glowed softly, and I sat alone, headphones humming with static, picking through frequencies that no one else noticed. The world outside was silent, but my mind replayed the canyon, the one I had survived years ago, the one that had taken the rest of my team. Frostline Recon. 6 operators, each trained for deep mountain operations, each carrying skills that could change the outcome of wars. And 3 weeks in, the mountains had swallowed them. I remember every detail, the subtle shift in snow underfoot, the pattern of enemy patrols, the moment the radios went silent. My orders were clear: observe, document, remain unseen. I couldn't move without exposing myself, couldn't fire without risking everyone I was supposed to protect. And so I watched. 5 of them died holding positions that nobody could reach in time, buying precious minutes for a convoy of civilians to escape. I remember their faces as the shots fell, the quiet acknowledgement in their eyes that they had chosen their fate. And I survived, alone, because I had been posted on the ridge, a ghost unseen, a witness to sacrifice. Years later, I still feel the weight of that survival pressing against my chest. Not guilt in the conventional sense. Survivor's guilt is too simple a word. It is a calculus of responsibility, a ledger of what lives were saved and what lives were lost because of choices made under impossible conditions. That memory fuels every calculation I make today. Every ridge I climb, every observation I log, every shot I take is a negotiation with that past. It is a promise I made silently to my fallen team, that I would never allow avoidable deaths if I could prevent them. And so I remain ghost tech to the world, a quiet analyst, a shadow behind the monitors. Yet beneath that exterior, every ridge, every canyon, every impossible shot is alive in my memory. I don't need recognition. I need precision. I need presence. I lean back, eyes tracing the lines of Ridge 17 on my screen. I remember the wind that shifted every 40 minutes, the heat drafts that could alter a bullet's path by nearly a meter, the hidden alcoves that could hide life, or end it. I know these places intimately, as if the stones themselves had taught me their language. The seals below had no idea. The enemy certainly didn't. But I had been there before, and that gave me something no map or satellite could ever provide. Intuition born of survival, instincts honed under impossible pressure, and a silent promise kept to those who could no longer speak. I tap a key, recording adjustments for future terrain mapping, but my thoughts drift back to Frostline. Each name, each face, each decision, they remain in me, quietly. I carry them in ways no commendation could ever measure. The mountain waits for me still. It remembers. And so do I. Months passed, and I returned to Aurora Point 22 not for combat, but for instruction. My orders were simple: train, observe, and remain in the background. No rifles, no direct engagement, just teaching others to read terrain as I did, to understand wind, angles, and patience. The first class arrived at dawn. 12 special operations volunteers, all eager to prove themselves. They expected drills, targets, and conventional lessons. Instead, I led them to Ridge 17, leaving their rifles behind. Today, the mountain speaks, I said. Not loud, not dramatic, just a statement of fact. I taught them to listen. The way snow moves over stones, the subtle change of air pressure against their skin, the echo of distant sounds. What do you hear? I asked. Not engines, not footsteps. What don't you hear? Silence was a signal. Absence was information. They struggled at first. Their minds sought immediate action, clear results, measurable outcomes. But this ridge had no shortcuts, no easy angles. I had them spread across the outpost, observing, noting every anomaly. I made them feel the mountain before they ever touched a rifle. By the second week, they began to understand. They noticed patterns I never pointed out explicitly. One trainee called out, "The bird stopped calling 3 minutes ago. Something's moving in Sector 7. Exactly. I nodded slightly. That was all the confirmation they needed. They were beginning to see the terrain as a system, not a backdrop. Week after week, I pushed them further. I placed targets at impossible angles, around steep inclines, behind ridges that offered no direct line of sight. They panicked at first, struggling to find a solution. Then I asked, "What's the move?" "Change the problem," I told them. "Don't force the shot. Work with the terrain. Become part of it." Each lesson was subtle. Some mornings, they arrived to find their gear arranged in patterns I had left overnight. Clues, puzzles, and exercises designed to sharpen awareness under pressure. I never explained them fully. Understanding had to be earned. And all the while, Ridge 17 watched silently, just as it had watched me years ago. Every ridge, every shadow, every gust of wind had a story to tell. The students learned to read it, not just to fire, but to survive, to respect the land, to trust their own instincts. I never stood behind a podium. I never demanded attention. I simply led by example, quietly moving through the ridge, observing, correcting, leaving trails of guidance that only the attentive would notice. My presence was felt but not seen. By the end of the season, they were no longer just sharpshooters. They were readers of the mountain, interpreters of terrain, learners of patience. I didn't need medals or praise. The quiet transformation was reward enough. Ridge 17 had become more than a training site. It had become a classroom, a silent mentor in its own right, carrying lessons only those willing to climb and pay attention could understand. I watched them ascend, observe, and finally comprehend that precision is born of awareness, not brute force. That sometimes the greatest victories come without firing a single shot. And for me, the ridge remained as it always had, a place of memory, of survival, and of quiet promises kept. The morning fog lay thick across Ridge 17. Visibility was low, wind gusts unpredictable, and snow crusted the narrow ledges. Perfect conditions for a lesson I had been saving for the advanced students. I briefed them simply. You're moving into a simulated ambush. There's no direct line of fire. Your goal is survival and observation. Make it out with awareness and tact. They looked at me with the mix of skepticism and anticipation I remembered from my first climb. No rifles, no safety nets, only the terrain, their senses, and what I had taught them. The gorge below became alive with imagined threats. I had set up markers and sound cues to simulate enemy positions, each designed to test their patience, their understanding of angles, their ability to read the mountain. Every misstep, every misread gust of wind would cost them time, forcing them to think critically, adapt quickly. One trainee froze at the edge of a ledge, eyes wide. I didn't offer guidance. He had to calculate the risk himself, gauge the snow's thickness, feel the wind against his body. Finally, he moved with deliberate steps, silent and precise. The pause had taught him more than any direct instruction could. Another group encountered enemy markers, small sensors releasing bursts of snow and debris to mimic gunfire. Their instinct was to fire blindly, to rush the path. I called out softly, "Stop! Breathe! Listen!" They hesitated, noticed subtle signs, the direction of falling snow, the echo of debris off the rocks. Adjustments were made. They moved without panic. They survived the simulation. I moved along the ridge, observing silently, adjusting minor details, watching their thought processes unfold. Their mistakes were expected. Their solutions were the lessons in action. Ridge 17 was no longer just a place of memory for me. It had become a living classroom. Later, at a narrow vantage point, a trainee asked, "Ma'am, how do you know what's happening before it even starts?" I looked at the gorge below, the patterns of wind and shadow, the subtle shifts in snow and stone. I remembered every failure, every survival, every lesson the mountains had taught me. "You feel it," I said simply. "Every ridge, every gust, every shadow has a story. Learn to listen. The rest will follow." By the end of the trial, the trainees had navigated the simulated ambush without a single casualty. They had learned what I had learned years ago. The mountain doesn't lie, but it demands respect. Awareness, patience, and precision, not firepower alone, determine survival. I watched them descend from Ridge 17, their movements more deliberate, their posture changed. They had absorbed more than just tactical knowledge. They had glimpsed the discipline of observation, the quiet power of patience, and the courage it takes to act decisively when everything seems impossible. Alone afterward, I traced my hand along the frostbitten rocks, remembering the ridge I had climbed during frostline. The canyon below had claimed my team once, but now it was teaching others, carrying the lessons forward silently. The ridge remembered, and so did I. Even in their success, I remained a ghost, an unseen presence, shaping outcomes without recognition. That was my choice. That was my legacy. By late afternoon, the fog had lifted from Ridge 17, revealing the gorge below in sharp relief. The trainees returned, each carrying the weight of what they had learned, physical exertion matched by mental transformation. They gathered silently, shivering, flushed with adrenaline, yet something deeper had shifted. One of them, a young operator from a distant special unit, looked at me and asked, "Ma'am, who trained you?" I smiled faintly, a gesture more instinct than acknowledgement. "The mountain," I said, letting the ambiguity settle. Some questions weren't meant to be answered, only experienced. They began sharing observations, how wind patterns had betrayed the simulated ambush, how subtle snow shifts had hinted at hidden routes, how their own senses had become instruments for survival. Each insight reminded me of years past, of frostline recon, and the quiet calculus of survival I had learned under impossible conditions. One trainee noticed a faint indentation in the rock, my mark, left as guidance for those paying attention. Another found a scrap of waterproof paper tucked in a crevice with a single phrase, "Patience defeats panic." They passed the notes among themselves like sacred texts, their whispers carrying awe and curiosity. Stories began forming, not of me directly, but of an unseen instructor who had guided them through impossible challenges, teaching the power of observation, patience, and decision-making under pressure. I watched them, proud yet distant. My work wasn't for recognition. The lessons weren't about me. They were about survival, awareness, and respect for the land and its rules. As the sun dipped below the ridge, casting long shadows across the gorge, I gathered my equipment. The trainees didn't protest. They understood instinctively that my role was always temporary, always at the edge of their perception. Before leaving, I left one final note tucked beneath a rock at the ridge's summit. "Invisible beats invincible." Not for accolades, not for records, just a reminder, a seed of guidance for those willing to climb and pay attention. Descending Ridge 17, I felt the familiar rhythm settle over me. The mountain, once a place of survival and loss, had become a silent witness to new lessons. My past, my skills, and my quiet philosophy would live on, even without my presence being formally acknowledged. Back at Aurora Point 22, the command logs recorded a standard exercise, routine adjustments, and successful navigation. No one would connect the dots to Frostline, to Ridge 17, or to the shadowy interventions that had guided survival outcomes. That was the way it was meant to be. Outside, the wind carried whispers through the rocks. Somewhere, in the minds of the trainees, my presence lingered, not as a name, not as a face, but as an invisible force shaping decisions, outcomes, and understanding. I packed my gear silently and stepped toward the path leading from the outpost. Ridge 17 would continue to teach in my absence. Stories would grow, legends would form, and the mountain would remember. I had done what was necessary. My work, as always, was complete. The wind was sharper that evening as I walked away from Ridge 17. The sun had dipped behind the peaks, casting long, fractured shadows across the snow. My boots crunched softly against the frost, leaving faint tracks destined to vanish with the next gust. I didn't look back. I never did. I thought of Frostline recon, of faces frozen in my memory, of choices made under impossible circumstances. The mountain had been both teacher and witness. Every ridge, every ledge, every gust of wind carried lessons etched in pain and survival. I had learned them the hard way, and now I had passed them on, silently, to those willing to listen. Aurora Point 22 was quiet behind me, the outpost unaware that the mountain's secret had just been reinforced. The SEALs and trainees would recount the trial, the exercises, the subtle puzzles, and hidden lessons. They would speak of an invisible guide, someone who shaped outcomes without fanfare. That was enough. Recognition wasn't mine to seek. Influence was. I paused briefly on a ridge above the path, feeling the wind sweep past like the sigh of the past itself. I traced the outlines of the gorge below, remembering each decision, each precise shot, each moment of frozen fear I had lived through alone. And I realized that those experiences had become something larger than survival. They had become a method, a philosophy, a way to merge instinct with knowledge, patience with action. Every student who climbed Ridge 17, every operator who would study its angles in years to come, would carry a piece of that philosophy forward. And some would never know it came from a ghost, a woman who had survived impossible odds and returned only to teach, quietly, from the edges of perception. I exhaled, letting the cold air fill my lungs. There were no medals waiting for me, no commendations, no record of heroics. Only the mountain, only the lessons, only the knowledge that lives could be saved when someone chose to observe, act, and vanish without seeking applause. My pack was light. My steps were measured. I left nothing behind but subtle markers for those attuned enough to notice. The ridge had claimed my past, shaped my skills, and now it would continue to pass its lessons along in silence. As darkness settled, I walked into the valley beyond the ridge, the lights of the outpost fading behind me. Somewhere, a trainee would find my final notes, some student would feel the echoes of the trials, and the story of an invisible mentor would grow. They might never know my name. They wouldn't need to. The mountain had remembered. I had remembered. And for anyone willing to listen, to watch, to learn, Ridge 17 would continue to teach the quiet, unassuming power of patience, awareness, and the courage to act when no one else could. I disappeared into the shadows, a ghost once more. My work wasn't done. It was eternal, carried in the rhythm of ridges, the whispers of wind, and the lessons passed quietly from hand to hand, from mind to mind. Somewhere, in the minds of those who had climbed, a silent figure would always be watching. Not for glory, not for recognition, just for the promise that someone would always be there when it mattered most. And that, I thought as I faded into the valley, was enough.